In this video, we're going to do a debrief of the business tax task 8 from AAT's second sample assessment. Task 8 is about tax planning and the responsibilities of the business and agent. And task 8 involves written responses. So the idea for this is that we want to write as many things as possible. The more points you make, the more marks you could possibly earn. So let's look at the information for the first part of this. So it tells us you are the accountant for Alison and her sister Barbara. Alison only takes a small salary out of her company, Alison Limited. The remainder of the profits extracted are taken in dividends so that Alison can pay less tax. Barbara is concerned that she is paying more tax than Alison and has asked you for a copy of Alison's personal tax return so she can compare it to her own. So first of all, explain whether Alison is engaged in tax avoidance, tax evasion, or tax planning. Now the question doesn't ask us to define each of these, but for revision purposes and for the purposes of this video, let's remind ourselves what these three things are. So first of all, tax planning is a legal way to minimise tax payable, and we're going to be applying the tax legislation in the way it was intended to pay less tax. And then tax avoidance is any legal method of reducing a taxpayer's liability, but by applying the tax legislation in a way not intended by the law. So this is legal, but it's not really what the tax legislation was trying to achieve. So an example of this would be using the director's loan account. So imagine that a director arranges for a company to lend money to the director rather than paying a salary. And so tax is paid on income, tax is not paid on loans. So by the company lending money to the director, which is legal, it would allow the director to pay less tax, which isn't really what they should be doing. And then tax evasion is an illegal method of seeking to pay less tax than is due by deliberately misleading HMRC. And this could be done in a couple of ways. We could simply be suppressing information, so just hiding information, failing to notify HMRC of any income. Or it could be by providing false information, so we could be doing the wrong things. Okay, but this is illegal. Okay, so the question doesn't ask us to do those three things, but we're just doing that for revision. So what we need to do now is decide whether Alison is engaged in one of these three things. So we know that she's taking a small salary out of her company, and then the rest of it she's taking out as dividends, and dividends are taxed with a lower rate than salary is. So in this case, she is going through tax planning because it's perfectly allowed for her to take profits out of the business in any way that she likes. So either through salary or through dividend. Yeah, dividends are perfectly a legal way to take the money out. So everything's okay here. There's nothing wrong with what Alison's doing. It is tax planning. Then in the second part of this, state why you cannot provide information requested by Barbara. Now the question is only for 1 mark, but there are two things we could say here to help us earn that 1 mark. So first of all, Alison's information is private to her, and we have a duty of confidentiality. So that's under the ethical principles that we have as accountants. It would also be a data breach under the Data Protection Act because that is private data that belongs to Alison and we cannot share that with other parties. Next, Warren retired several years ago and spent time on his hobby of making metal sculptures. He made several large sculptures for his own garden as well as gifts and presents for his family and friends. Each time he finished a sculpture, he shared it on social media and began to build a following. In August 23, he agreed to sell one of the sculptures he had in his garden at a significant profit. Since then, he has sold 4 more sculptures from his garden and has also made 6 sculptures requested by members of the public, all of which he has sold at a profit. So we need to discuss whether Warren is trading by reference to the badges of trade. You should ensure that you reach a conclusion, and notice there are 4 marks available for this. Now notice the command verb here, discuss. So imagine you're having a discussion. How many people do you need to have a discussion? Well, a minimum of two. So imagine two people are discussing this. So this person could be trading or could not be. And that's what we need to identify in terms of our answer. The question doesn't expect us to go through all badges of trade because there's only 4 marks available here. But for revision purposes, let's recap on all of them. So one of the badges of trade is that there is a profit-seeking motive. In other words, that there is an intention of reselling at a profit. So we get 1 mark for explaining what the badge of trade is, and then a 2nd mark for applying it to the scenario. So what do you think? Did Warren have an intention to get profit? At first it suggests not, because he was just making them for his garden. But now, based on what's happening with selling sculptures to members of the public, and they're being made for them rather than just selling them to the garden, and also he's got this social media presence as well, it would suggest that at the moment there is an incentive to get profits. There is that intention. Another badge of trade relates to the number of transactions or the frequency of those transactions. So because if there are quite a lot of transactions, it may indicate trading. So we can see at first there weren't very many transactions, but now there are. So in August 23, he sold 1 of the sculptures, and then he sold 4 more, and then there's been another 6. There have been a total of 11 sales since August 23. And that might be enough to suggest that this is trading. So make sure that you use the information provided in the scenario because it's there to help you earn your marks. Another badge of trade is to think about the nature of the assets or the sculptures. Are they for personal use or are they for some sort of investment? So at first, the metal sculptures were being used in the garden, which would be for personal use. It wasn't as if he was investing in them and you're holding them for a gain in their value. Remember, trading is different to investing. There's a different type of profit. We're talking about trading profits rather than capital gains. So what are we doing with these assets? Are we buying them with the purpose of reselling them, or are we just holding them for ourselves? So we can say that at first the sculptures were for personal use, but now they're being commissioned and made for customers, and this would suggest trade. Remember that the question does tell us, ensure you reach a conclusion. So for the 3 badges we've looked at so far, all of them suggest there is trading going on. Another badge of trade relates to the existence of similar trading transactions or interests. So we know that some sculptures are for personal use. Warren just has them in his garden and therefore his enjoyment. So we can imagine that Warren will say, look, I'm not trading because they're just for my personal use. But we've seen there have been 11 sales to customers. So there are similar trading transactions, and therefore that would suggest there's trading going on. Another badge of trade relates to any changes to the asset. So if an asset is purchased and then subjected to a process before selling it on, then that would suggest there's trading going on. So in this case, Warren has his sculptures, and it could be that a sculpture in the garden needs to be adjusted before someone wants to buy it. But that's not happening here. People are just buying the sculptures in his garden, so there is no change to the asset. Having said that, he is buying metal and he's working with the metal to make the statues. So there is some change. There is a process going on before selling. But it's not like Warren is simply buying sculptures and then selling them to other people. For example, imagine I just bought an antique from my home. I wouldn't do anything to it, but I might sell it on to somebody else in the future. That isn't trading. I've not done anything to that antique. It's just been sitting in my house. So in this case, it is quite different. Warren is making something out of the metal, and that would suggest that the asset is changing and therefore trading. Another badge of trade is to think about the way the sale is carried out. So If it looks like a sale, then it probably is a sale and it looks like trading. So in this case, we know that Warren was sharing it on social media, which he might do because he's just proud of his own work. But it could be that this is advertising. And if it looks like he's advertising on social media, then it looks like it's trading. If he were just accidentally selling things to friends, then that would be different. But it looks now that he's being commissioned to do some work, and that looks like trading. Another badge of trade is the source of finance, where a loan is required to acquire an asset which will be repaid through the sale of the asset is likely to indicate trading. In this case, this isn't particularly relevant, so we can't apply it to Warren. But we're just revising the badges of trade. We also need to consider the interval of time between purchase and sale. So if an item is bought and then resold shortly afterwards, that would suggest that we're trading. So how does that apply in this case? Well, at first there was a long period between making a sculpture and selling, because Warren was just putting them in his garden for his own personal use. But now we're told that he's making them to order. So customers are commissioning sculptures, and therefore he's going to deliver them to them immediately. It's a very short interval of time between purchase and resale, and again this would therefore suggest trading. And finally, we've got the method of acquisition as another badge of trade. So it depends on how we're acquiring these statues. So if we were, say, inheriting them and then selling them on, that would not suggest trading. Or if we received them as a gift and then sold them on, that would not suggest trading. But if we were sort of buying things on a regular basis and then selling them on, that would suggest trading. In this case, Warren is purposely buying the metal and making statues according to customer orders, so this would suggest trading. So overall, based on a mixture of these badges of trade, I think we can conclude that Warren is trading. So let's look at the last part of this task. So we have to explain the tax implications of each business structure that Lyra is considering, identifying which types of tax will be due and at what rates. You're not required to complete tax computations. And notice there are 5 marks available here, so we need to make sure we write enough to score enough to get a pass. So Lyra has completed her training as a financial advisor and is starting a new business providing financial advice. She expects to make profits of $50,000 in her first year and $80,000 in each subsequent year. She will initially pay herself a salary of £1,000 per month from the business, but may need more money than that for her personal spending during each year. She has no other income. She is unsure whether she should start a business as a sole trader or as a limited company. So there are some legal implications of choosing to be a sole trader or a limited company, but the question is asking us to explain the tax implications of these. Remember that you've got information in the reference materials in terms of different tax rates. So we've got tax rates for sole traders. There are also tax rates for companies. So first of all, let's think about it from a sole trader point of view. So Lyra, it would be taxed on the $50,000 profit and also on the $12,000 salary. Now it's not particularly clear from the text whether that salary is part of the $50,000 or not. So it could be that the profit is after paying the salary, or the profit is before paying the salary. Okay, it's not clear from the text. So yeah, potentially she'd be taxed on either $50,000 or on $62,000, depending on how that salary is structured. So yeah, it doesn't really matter whether it's profit or salary. It's all part of Lyra's general income, and it'll be subject to tax. Lyra's salary is not an allowable expense and would need to be added back to the profits to work out what the taxable amount was. So of this $50,000 or $62,000, I remember in the subsequent year she could be earning $80,000 profits. It could be 80 or 92. It's not clear in the text. But anyway, the first $12,570 of this would be covered by the personal allowance. and Lyra would pay no tax on the personal allowance amount. Then the next £37,700 of income would be taxed at the basic rate of tax, which is 20%. So that would apply in the first and all subsequent years. And then any income above that basic rate band would be taxed at the higher rate of 40%. So in the first year, that might apply if the total income is 62,000, but it wouldn't be relevant if the total income is 50,000. Again, it's not really clear from the text which is their total profits. But in the second year, when she's earning 80,000, she would definitely go above the basic rate band and start paying tax at 40%. Let's not forget national insurance contributions as well, and the reference materials help us with that. So we can see in the reference materials that Lyra would have to pay Class 4 national insurance contributions on any trading profits between the 12,570 and 50,270. Again, notice that the gap between these two figures is the same, 37,700. So any income that she's having to pay the basic rate tax, she would also have to pay the 6% national insurance. And then above that basic rate band, there is a 2% contribution. So as we said just now, for her income, for the first year, she may or may not have to pay the higher rate tax, depending on whether that 50,000 includes the salary or not. But certainly for years 2, 3 and so on following, when she's earning 80,000, then she'd also have to pay 2% Class 4 national insurance contributions as well. So what if Lyra wanted to become a company? Well, let's think about the salary to begin with. So Lyra's receiving a salary as an employee. It's £12,000 a year, remember. And she'd have to pay national insurance and income tax on that, as she would if she were a sole trader. But as we saw just now, her 12,000 salary would be absorbed by the 12,570 personal allowance. And similarly, that 12,000 falls below the threshold for paying the national insurance. So there would be no national insurance or salary or income tax to pay on her salary. However, looking at the reference materials, again, thinking about salaries, there would be employer national insurance at 13.8% for any salary above 9,100. But there is an employment allowance of 5,000. So let's just see whether that would have an impact. So we would have our 12,000 salary, of which 9,100 is the threshold. So we would have 2,900. And then if we multiply that by 13.8%, we have a national insurance contribution of £400, which is less than the 5,000, so there would be no employer national insurance to pay either. So we can add that to our answer. The company would not need to pay any employer national insurance contributions because it would be covered by the employment allowance of £5,000. Now, what about the company itself? So we can see that we've got a lower limit of £50,000, and that would be taxed at 19%. But once we breach that, then we'd have to pay 25%, although in between the 50,000 and 250,000, we would attract marginal relief. So there would be less tax to pay. So we can say the company would pay 19% corporation tax on profits up to £50,000. Again, from the text, it's not really clear whether that 50,000 includes her salary or not. So we're not really sure. But yes, it's likely, isn't it, that we've got that 50,000 profits and we're paying 19%. And then above that, we'd have to start paying 25% less the marginal relief. So we can make that statement as well. And notice the style of the answer as well while we're looking at this written question. we're trying to write everything in these short, punchy paragraphs. So basically, we're encouraging the marker to give us a mark for each paragraph we have. So try to avoid big blocks of text because they're quite difficult for the marker to read, and they have to apply their judgment and decide how many marks a big paragraph could earn. But if you set out your answer as we see on the screen now, we've got a series of one-line statements, each of them trying to get 1 mark each. Now, the other thing we can think about as well is that Lyra could, as well as getting salary, because we mentioned that already, but Lyra could also extract dividends from the company, and notice that dividend tax rates are lower than general income tax rates. So that could also be preferential for Lyra. So we can say that Lyra can extract income from the company in the form of dividends. Now remember, she's got a salary of £12,000 and that's used some of her personal allowance, but she still has £570 left. So £570 of whatever dividend she takes would still be tax-free because that's covered by her personal allowance. There's also, on top of that, a dividend allowance, and that would also reduce how much tax she has to pay. We don't have to worry about what the dividends allowance is for this exam. And then any dividend that's above the personal allowance and above the dividend allowance would then be taxed at 8.75% as long as it was in the basic rate band. And this is lower than the general income tax rate, so that will be advantageous for Lyra. Again, now notice in terms of exam technique, look at the 2 answers we've got on the screen at the moment. The first one is a very short paragraph earning 1 mark, whereas the second paragraph goes on for 5 and a bit lines, and that's just harder for the marker to read. And also the marker would have to decide how many separate ideas are included in this paragraph. Is this worth 3 marks, 2 marks, 4 marks? And the risk is that you might not earn as many marks as you hope just because you've presented your answer as a big block of unfriendly text. Now we saw in the reference materials there's also rates for the higher rate band as well, which we could also mention in our answer. But we saw that in the reference materials. Again, we're not going to sort of include that in text in this video now.